All right, and we are live after a fashion. We have, welcome everybody. We have at least one of my guests, at least, is trying to respond to my invitation to enter the Hangout and is not receiving any of the invitations either in his Google Plus notification area or in his email. And we've tried 2 emails. So there's a couple folks I knew wouldn't be with us today, and at least one other who may be trying to get in. So maybe at some point we'll find out what happened here, but maybe not. But I want to thank Dave Garber for his good faith effort to join us in the OOTLE15 Biblical Scholar Google On Air Hangout this week here in the spring of 2015. This Hangout, as always in this series, is in service of the Open Online, I always say it wrong, the Open Old Testament Learning Event. And here I'm just toggling windows while I try to talk, which can be found at OOTLE15.net, OOTLE15.net. And students and others are following this conversation on Twitter. Dave, if you're able, you could join us on Twitter. You'll be in good company among our learners there. And so this might be a short hangout today. And we can just, I can take questions through Twitter, see what people are talking about on Twitter. The topic this week is, we're still in the latter prophets. In this course, we've done the writings, and now we're doing the latter prophets in anticipation of moving even further backwards into the former prophets beginning next week. For my part, I don't mind saying it, and it may just be a function of where we are in the semester, but I'm ready to move on. I'm almost at the point where I feel like 3 weeks of the latter prophets is sort of gilding the lily, softened somewhat by the fact that in this week I intentionally spread things out so that we're not only looking at the responses of prophets, real according to Hoyle prophets, to Babylonian exile, but also looking at folks like the Deuteronomists, the Deuteronomistic editors, who are editing the Deuteronomistic history in the book of Deuteronomy in light of the Babylonian exile, and the priestly writer who is undertaking his own work. Both of these groups, the Deuteronomistic editors and the priestly writers, doing that wonderful thing of rewriting history in order to address the present, revising history in order to look to the future. It's one of those things, I get really excited about biblical writers doing it, and I tear my hair out when people do it in the present. But to be getting into narrative, I feel like I'm ready to sort of give the prophets a rest with all of their shouting and their angst and their prescriptions, and beginning to get into narrative in its more pure form as we get into the former prophets. Let's see what's going on Twitter right now. Oh, okay. I hope a standing stone has not fallen on Dr. Lester. Thank you very much. No, I'm fine. And learners who are worried that it's their own stuff. Yeah, we are absolutely on now. Local interest in the OOTLE15 hashtag on Twitter. I see that there's some work going into putting together something of a study group or an exam review group. So learners, if you did not see that already on the Twitter, then take a look at that hashtag and get involved if you wish. What are some of the things going on? There's this is the time of year, the biblical scholar, like what's happening with biblical scholars, like right about now, and maybe with some of your other instructors, this is the time of year when proposals are due for the SBL AAR conference. What this is the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion. Now, the conference is way off. The conference takes place the weekend before Thanksgiving, but as is usual for these kinds of, kind of mega conferences with thousands and thousands of participants and hundreds and hundreds of rooms filled with all these series of presentations and talks and workshops and lectures and things like this, is you have to send in your proposal way ahead of time. And so proposals were due just a week ago at the near the beginning, a week or two ago, near the beginning of March, and they're being worked through now. There's this is the nature of conferences, and if you wonder if this is really the best way to do things, because remember, the purpose of a conference is to be able to look at what people are doing currently. Theoretically, what's happening is people are bringing their work in progress to the conference to sort of try it out in front of a live audience and get feedback on it, and which will, in principle, help us to revise our thinking, revise our work, so that our work, so that those ideas can become ultimately publishable. But of course, by the time the weekend before Thanksgiving rolls around, if your proposal was due 8 months or thereabouts before, that might not be your current thinking anymore. It might not be the current form of what you're doing. And an alternative to the conference model, especially the sort of like mega conference model, is something called the unconference. And this is where in an unconference, you don't propose papers or presentations ahead of time, or even workshops ahead of time, but rather there's sort of a topic around which the conference is made. You can do biblical studies or what have you. And then everybody comes, and when we arrive at the conference, that's when we get together, and facilitators help us to decide then and there what the sessions of the conference are going to be, what what ideas are going to be sort of hashed out and proposed and talked about and hashed out, what workshops might happen. This happens in a quick and dirty way at the very beginning of the conference, and then the rest of the weekend is doing the conference. One of the appeals of the unconference method then is that nobody's reading papers at you, right? Because nobody has prepared a paper, because nobody knew exactly what was going to happen until we all get together and work it out. So if that kind of thing interests you, you might be interested in things like that camp. So you can do a Google search for that camp, or just do a Google search for unconference and sort of see something about where that model has come around. A book that talks about the unconference model, yes, I happen to have it handy, is Mob Rule Learning by Michelle Boole. So you can read about that in her introduction. So that's what's happening in the academic, in our part of the academic calendar, and it may have at least a little bit to do beyond just being far into the semester, why some of your professors are beginning to look a little bit as exhausted and distracted as you, in fact, look to yourself in the mirror. Okay, so Will Meacham is throwing out an idea in Twitter. He says, let me throw this out. Why don't we simply change the canon to 3 Isaiahs? I kind of like that. Change the canon. Heaven forfend. The Masorete in me says, heaven forfend. The Masoretes, for anyone who's ever taken Hebrew or has any acquaintance with Hebrew Bible in the sense of, the Bible written in Hebrew, the Masoretes are the folks who, in the Common Era, I want to say 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, like in this period, these are the ones who were transmitting the Hebrew text, which at that time was a consonantal Hebrew text. Ancient Hebrew, like the other ancient Semitic languages, written in ways in orthography that only represented the consonantal sounds. The Masoretes are those who, there were others who created systems of representing the vowels in the biblical text. The Masoretes produced the one that carried the day and that is still used in Hebrew Bibles. And but one of the mandates that the Masoretes sort of set for themselves was not to change the consonantal text, even where they knew the text was in error, that from copying from one generation to the next. Even where the Masoretes felt that the text had fallen into some kind of error, they would correct it by putting the vowels for what they believed to be the correct text around the consonants of the incorrect text. There's more to it than that, and there's other ways that they worked with the text but that's the kind of thing that they did. So the Masoretan, he says, no, we're not going to just change the canon, Mr. Meacham. But 3 Isaiahs, I mean, you could. I could certainly see a Bible that sort of, I mean, isn't that what the footnotes do, right? So if you read a study Bible, when you get to Isaiah 40, you ought to get like a big, maybe they should put it in all shouty caps or color the font or something and say, oh, okay, we're into something different now. Look, a different voice is speaking. Look, it's speaking from the standpoint of Babylonian exile instead of during the, anticipating the Assyrian menace. Look, it's talking about how, we should comfort the people for the Babylonian exile that they have already undergone, rather than warning of being dispersed by the Assyrians or by the Babylonians, for that matter. It's an interesting idea. I suspect that if we were talking about just, some kind of secular literature like Chaucer or Shakespeare or something, we would see a lot of that by now. I am reminded a little bit, and it's not exactly the same thing. Who was it? Was it Friedman? Richard Elliott Friedman, who published the Book of J, where, he sort of said, okay, we all talk about in the Pentateuch being written by at least 4 sources, J, E, D, and P, and the textbooks will sometimes extract some of these sources and show you sort of in the flood story, show you, the J elements and the P elements in separate columns. So you can read them in isolation. And he did that with the Book of J, in part to show that he believed that the Book of J goes well beyond the Pentateuch into the following books of the Bible. So that would be that's another thing that's a little similar to what something has done in terms of changing the canon to to something like the 3 Isaiahs. What else do we have here? I don't know if it's Leslie says I don't know if it's cheating. I want to talk about because this is works that some students have done for homework. I want to talk about the concept of OT Messiah versus the way it's talked about in Christian circles today. Huge topic, because so folks understand this week, one of the things folks are looking at is the way that Isaiah chapters 40 to 55 talks about Cyrus the Persian as Messiah. Something that I can tell you something I learned this week, or I love the fact that I learn something new every time I teach this class. What I had known out of my studies are the ways in which that the people of Judea, of the district of Judea, formerly the kingdom of Judah, the ways in which they talked about the God of Israel taking Cyrus the Persian by that. Cyrus the Persian being, right, the Persian who comes along and just wallops the daylights out of the Babylonians, right? And it's understandable that that some among the people of Israel would see Cyrus as a savior sent by God to punish the Babylonians. It's worth noting, I mean, look at how polyvocal the response to exile is, even just by inference from that example. We may tend to look at the Hebrew Bible as saying in a very univocal, kind of flat sort of way, oh, God brings nations against the people of Israel, and punish them for their sins. God brought the Babylonians against the people of Israel, for their sins. And that is certainly a dominant strain of the Hebrew Bible, thanks to the Deuteronomists and the Deuteronomistic reading of the prophets, and the choices about which prophets are preserved. So that the God of Israel is seen as taking Cyrus the Persian by the hand and bringing him against the Babylonians, that Cyrus is acting that Cyrus is brought by God, and against the Babylonians. That similarly that others saw it the same. That others saw it the same way, and the Egyptians and so on, and the Babylonians themselves, at least in retrospect, see it this way. What I hadn't observed until we read the piece by, and I want to make sure I get it right. This is from Bible Odyssey. The piece by Lisbeth Freed in Bible Odyssey, Elizabeth S. Freed, talking about the way in which the Egyptians and others used the language of the theological language associated with kingship with regard to Messiah. So, for example, specifically, the Egyptians calling Cyrus Pharaoh, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The Babylonians calling him the crown prince, just like Belshazzar, was crown prince. It was normal in frequently in Babylon, you would have the king, but there was also the crown prince who served in a kind of co-regency with the king. Think of it as learning by doing, or an apprenticeship, right? The crown prince rules alongside of the king because one day he will succeed the king. And in that same way, the analogy there is so close to the way that Isaiah greets, the second Isaiah, the Isaiah 40 to 55, greets Cyrus as the Lord's anointed, because the Lord's anointed, that is the Judean king. And so that I'd been aware of the analogies between the people Israel and the way they greeted Messiah, the way they understood Cyrus's activity in ways analogous to the way that the Egyptians saw the god or gods of Egypt bringing Cyrus, or the Babylonian. But that little piece of language that welcoming him as Pharaoh, God of Upper and Lower Egypt, in the same way they recognize him as the Lord, as Yahweh's anointed. That was very interesting for me. I had not seen that. What else is happening here? A chronological Bible. Oh, don't even think. Oh boy, what a lot of work that would be. How granular would you go on a chronological Bible, right? Just like, you start ripping into like half verse by quarter verse by eighth of a verse. Oh my goodness. Not that it mightn't be fun to try, right? Just because something's impossible doesn't mean that you shouldn't take a crack at it just as a learning experience. Huge. Who is a Messiah and who is not? Neo in the Matrix, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and so on. What is the RTA Shar says there's no here's how you spot the Messiah checklist. The Matrix. I don't know if Luke Skywalker. Someone help me. All right, I can't do this myself. I see Luke Skywalker, definitely Luke Skywalker. What makes Luke Skywalker a Messiah? And part of what, let's actually even make it more difficult. Because in Western culture, it is very common to you can't do literary criticism in Western culture without talking about Christ figures, right? And some people will find a Christ figure in almost every narrative, but we're not talking about Jesus the Messiah, right? Because the Jesus followers in the New Testament period, they are going to be ringing their own very particular changes and on the concept of Messiah, right? Think of it almost like how metaphor works. That is, Messiah is a big enough and complex enough constellation of ideas. Monarchy, isn't it, right? Monarchy in the history of the people Israel is a large enough idea with a complicated a complicated arrays of connotations. And when Jesus is seen as Messiah by New Testament writers, they are grabbing onto some of those connotations and saying, look, Jesus, and they're suppressing others of those connotations because they are not readily applicable to Jesus. So let's leave Jesus aside, and looking at the Old Testament messiahs like Cyrus, messiahs in the way that it's suggested by Zechariah, but even to open it up, Messiah just in the way, just monarchy. Let's just say monarchy, because that's a word we actually know. What about monarchy in the, so this idea, it's really return of the king, right? Arthur is in British legend, right, is, this idea of a king who will return, that rightly God has appointed a monarch who is not with us now, but who will be with us. Arthur is one. Tolkien obviously, plays on this with in the Lord of the Rings, where the third of the books is called The Return of the King. You can read all of Lord of the Rings and not really quite get that for Tolkien, this is largely not just about doing away with the big bad guy and about the ring and everything, but there has to be a return of this king. So Aragorn, right? Aragorn is definitely a messiah. He is literally a messiah. He is the king for whom the anointed one, for whom we are waiting. Frodo Baggins, Bilbo Baggins. That's interesting. Not kings. I don't want to just try to answer. I always say the last thing I want to do with a good question is to just dishonor it with a straight answer. I don't feel like Frodo and Bilbo make messiahs for me, but as always, I'm willing to be convinced. 50 ways to, we need a BuzzFeed on 50 ways to spot a messiah. Maybe that'll be a make for a future rendition of this course. Shar notes that the Essenes had two messiahs. If I remember correctly, I'm not an Essene scholar. The Essenes, right? These are the Dead Sea Scrolls people, right? Not everybody agrees. Fill that in for absolutely everything, almost every claim we make in a class like this. But a priestly messiah and a monarchical messiah, as I recall, is what the Essenes are waiting for, which jibes really, 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 really well with the post-exilic biblical material that is looking at Zerubbabel. They're looking at the because in the district of Judea after the Babylonian exile, it's not a monarchy anymore. It's not good. Doesn't look like it's going to be a monarchy any soon. It's part of it had been part of the Babylonian Empire, is now part of the Persian Empire, and the language there about Zerubbabel and Zerubbabel, the governor of Judea, and Joshua, the high priest of the temple. And they are both, side by side, vested in works like Zechariah, possibly Haggai, with language that dances around and dances around and dances around ideas of monarchy. So you get a Zerubbabel, or just fill in. Maybe it doesn't have to be Zerubbabel, but Zerubbabel is of the Davidic line, and so to refer to him as the branch, or to call him branch, to describe him as Yahweh's signet ring. I think both he and Joshua are referred to as anointed. Someone would have to check me on this. I'm always scared to speak extemporaneously because of how many times I'll be wrong. Figure I'll be wrong about 1 out of 4 times when I make a claim without looking it up. So, but both. So the pair of messiahs, right? So there already there's the idea that messianic expectations can be fulfilled corporately. They can be filled by 2 people at once. You can have 2 side-by-side guys that are fulfilling messianic expectations. You may have 1 guy who's going to fulfill messianic expectations. Some will say that now here's the thing. It really bothers me when we talk about the servant in Isaiah 40 to 55 as Messiah, because A, He's never called a Messiah ever in Isaiah 40 to 55 at all. And Isaiah 40 to 55 already has a Messiah, right? It has Cyrus, my anointed, Cyrus, my Messiah, says God. And at the same time, it is sometimes said that second Isaiah 40 to 55, Babylonian exilic Isaiah, second Isaiah's solution to messianic expectation is to corporatize it. I've sometimes heard it called democratizing, which I'm not crazy about because he's certainly not proposing a democracy. But the messianic expectations devolve upon the people as a whole, as represented by the servant of Yahweh, right? The servant of Yahweh representing the exilic people Israel, who undergo suffering beyond what is deserved, right? As right there in chapter 40, you've suffered double, suffered double for all your sins, who suffer undeserved suffering, who continue to suffer the humiliation unto death that is Babylonian exile. Because when Yahweh takes the servant by the hand and exalts him to previously unanticipated heights, that is the restoration of the people Israel in their land, then the nations, right, Isaiah 52 and 53, who has believed what we have heard, who has seen, who has anticipated what we have seen, that this people that have been, beaten apparently to death, have been raised up to over the world, that Israel will be raised up over the world again, and all will come to see what God has done in the people of Israel, in their restoration, in their exaltation, and the nations will learn something about the God of Israel that they never anticipated before. That is, that the God of Israel is the God of the cosmos. So by that means, it's argued that that is second Isaiah's solution to messianic expectations. All of these messianic expectations, obviously coming from the fact that there is 2 Samuel 7 to be dealt with. There are the Psalms, the royal Psalms to be dealt with. There are two covenants, and this is an excellent introduction to the former prophets, which is coming right down the pipe, that there are two covenants in view. There's the Sinai covenant, which is very conditional in its connotations. There are stipulations associated with the Sinai covenant, things that the people undertake to do, that is the law, whereas the Davidic covenant, as seen in 2 Samuel 7 and in Psalms and elsewhere, is that God has made an everlasting covenant with David. God has made an everlasting covenant, unlike the covenant God made with Saul, that even when David's descendants will sin, even when they will displease God, even when they will make the kinds of mistakes that Saul and others might make, they will be punished, and the people will be punished, and they'll be scattered to foreign lands, and so on and so on. But there will always be a Davidic king in Jerusalem. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell, right? And yet so in the reality of there not being a Stark in Winterfell, where there's not a Davidic king on the throne of Jerusalem, this has to be explained. It must be true that God's promises endure. So how is that explained? How is that explained theologically in light of the fact evident to eyes that it's failed, right? That it appears to have failed. How do we go beyond the appearance of the failure of God's covenant to David while there is no king? And that of course where the messianic expectations are coming from. I know it's horrible to have silence while I'm sitting here looking at the Twitter feed. Judas Maccabeus as Messiah. Oh boy. As a Daniel scholar, I should be all over that because it falls right into that period. I don't feel comfortable about. I don't know what the ways are. I do not know what the ways are that Judas Maccabeus was or wasn't understood as a Messiah. I feel like someone's going to sneak up behind me and say boo and say, oh, look at these obvious ways in which you knew that was the case or wasn't the case. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise in the Twitter feed or for folks to look at later. Judas Maccabeus, what this is, right, folks, is this is where you remember in the book of Daniel, taking place in the 2nd century BCE and written during 167 to 164 during Antiochus Epiphanes' desolation of the temple and suppression of Judaism. And the Maccabees were the group that succeeded Seleucid rule over Jerusalem. So again, that motif of, Yahweh bringing a savior in the form of the hammer, Judas Maccabeus against these oppressors and driving them out. He's a very Cyrus-like figure. He absolutely is. So I would be appalled if there's not messianic language associated with that, surviving or not. I know. Turning your thoughts upside down around the servant of Isaiah never being called a Messiah. It's Handel's fault. Handel has led you astray in this regard. Wait, Shar, who's a gladiator? Who's a gladiator and not a Messiah? I see it's a she, and I don't know who that's being referred to. Olivia Pope. See, I haven't watched that show. Every time I see Olivia Pope, I think we're talking about Olivia Dunham from Fringe. Okay. Would you say, now here's a question that's happening amongst us. Would you say, the coming of age story, how come there's not a coming of age story for Jesus's baptism and the dove descending on him? How come there's no coming of age element in our Messiah story for Jesus? Are there normally coming of age elements in Messiah stories? Harry Potter, right? Okay, thanks, Joni. Jonah hashtags Harry Potter there. When does that become a necessity? It certainly doesn't seem to be a biblical necessity. We don't have to know about Cyrus's childhood as a poor waif who's forced to live under the stares of his cruel aunt and uncle in that way. And who else, I think there is when we're getting into folktale elements becoming a standard part of the modern day appropriation or expression of the messianic story. I think that feels like that kind of motif, because where you do have that kind of coming of age story is like Russian folk tales. If you want to look into this, here's where you go for this. Is it Victor or Vladimir? Victor Propp, Propp. And Propp, this was structuralism, right? Or at least one form of structuralism. Victor Propp is the man who studied Russian folktales, and he had this idea. You'll like this, Star Wars people. This is where, and Harry Potter people and others, this is where he says that in any Russian folktale, there's a collection of elements that you can draw from. Think of it as a bag of resources, a bag of elements. And so one of these elements might be, right, so Star Wars fans, the mysterious guide passes a talisman to the young hero. This was your father's. So that may be one. The idea for Propp, though, is that no one Russian folktale is going to use every single one of these elements. Any given Russian folktale, I think there's like 22 of them or something like that. There's a bunch. He's got them listed. And out of these 22 or 25 or 20 or whatever elements, any given Russian folktale may only use 14 of them or 12 or only 8. It depends on the complexity of the tale. But here's the thing. For Propp, they will always be used in the right order. So any given Russian folktale will draw only upon some limited set of these available elements, but they will always have to use them in the canonical order, right? The hero cannot receive his mysterious this talisman from the mysterious guide before he is orphaned, right, and loses his parents or whatever it is. So I tend to wonder if we're associating coming of age stories with the modern version of the messianic stories. I think the folk tales have gotten in there, which is understandable because you're trying to tell a whole story. Yeah, way to go, Handel. All right. Okay, wow, we have been at this for a long time, longer than I thought. Thanks, folks. Take a moment, and if anybody wants to throw anything onto the Twitter while I'm preparing to wrap things up here. This was a great stream. I don't know how it's going to come out when I look at it later, but it felt like a very good communal stream of consciousness on mostly around Messiah, but other issues around the responses to exile. Shar goes out on a limb and says, I say you have to be anointed to be a Messiah. That's right. Get out on that limb. Good. So put anything in the Twitter on the OOTLE15 while I'm getting ready to wrap things up here, and I'll address anything before we go. But this is the last of the latter prophets Google Hangouts, and we're going to be short on Google Hangouts for the former prophets because of the way spring break falls, and so we're into housekeeping now. So sorry for those of you that watch this like 2 years from now and it doesn't matter anymore. Maundy Thursday is next week. I don't think we'll have a hangout for Maundy Thursday. Spring break is that's really the beginning of Garrett's spring break. Spring break falls during the next week. I don't think we'll have a Google Hangout then. So I think next week we will have the one and only Google Hangout for the former prophet. So we're going to have to really bring the ruckus on the former prophets next week. For students who are worried about how the absence of Hangouts is going to affect your ability to do what you need to do for this class, don't worry. Provisions are being made and will be communicated to you. Don't sweat. We don't mean for you to be worried about things and to be afraid. No learning happens when you're afraid. John Cleese teaches us that, by the way, that if you want to create conditions in which no creativity happens and nobody is able to create learning for themselves, all you have to do is scare the wits out of them to make sure that that happens. That's from John Cleese's lecture on creativity. Look it up. Google that. Good. Anointed as what? Savior, king? I'd say king. Anointed as king. You're not really anointed as anything else as a king. Although, as we'll see in the Pentateuch, anointing, of course, actually like slapping oil on stuff or people or things. The temple, the elements of the tabernacle are anointed, and they're certainly not being made into kings. By the exilic, post-exilic period, there is, like Joshua the high priest is anointed. I think these become variations or a kind of broadening, but anointing basically means monarchy, and I think it becomes generalized to mean a being set apart for God and being set apart for God's use, and therefore being equated with holiness in that respect, holy as defined as that which is set apart for God. But in its origins, and I'm open to correction on this, in its origins, it's really all about the monarchy. It's really all about the monarchs. Jonah Holm notes that Ralph Klein was my Pentateuch and Wisdom prof, by the way. It was great to see the shout out in this week's lecture. Yeah, I took a Pentateuch class from Ralph Klein, Professor Klein at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. That was a life changer. That was a big one. No doubt about it. So, all right. Thank you all for hanging with me in this solo flight for the Google Biblical Scholars, or in this case, Google Biblical Scholar Hangout on Air. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you next time. Thanks very much. This was, do I have to say any of that stuff? Yeah, you saw it at the beginning. OOTLE15, OOTLE15.net, and so on. And thanks very much again. Bye.